you've been, I think, in a helpful way, vocal about some of the things that you've seen in academia from your perspective. I want to start by asking you, what are your expectations for philosophers when they, in terms of like political discourse and what they say publicly, both in the publishing world and also on social media? Like, what do you, maybe expectations and standards for philosophers when they engage in that sort of like political discourse?
One of my biggest complaints is what my friend Rishi Joshi calls politically motivated selective demands for rigor. So, once you see these things, you probably will see them everywhere. So a selective demand for rigor is just, something that you like. Maybe it's a former student, maybe it's a friend. You lower the standards because you want this person to get their ideas out there because you like them. But politically motivated standards for selective demands for rigor involve what passes for serious philosophy, often in the best presses or the best journals, is just not very good. And I don't think I say that just because I disagree with it. I think often what passes is grad school work, undergrad work. It's at that level, but reviewers eager to pass it along or to show their approval, make sure those ideas get out there. The standards get lower. So, whereas if you're writing on something more controversial, among philosophers, if you're running something more controversial, the standards go way up. And anyone who's tried to publish anything controversial has experienced it. So that's one thing I wish philosophers were better at, is applying consistent standards. I think that's very difficult to do. I don't think it's easy to keep a level head and try to impose the same standards on your ideological enemies as you do your friends. This is one argument for the value of intellectual diversity in higher ed, though. I think a lot of stuff that becomes faddish or becomes trendy in academia is stuff that would have been criticized more quickly or might not even have made it to print if the discipline, whatever discipline, if the discipline were more ideologically diverse. So that's the thing that I kind of grinds my gears a lot, is the ideologically motivated selective demands for rigor.
Yeah, good. I think that's really helpful. When you talk about the standards being lowered, let's say, do you have in mind mostly like the principles and methodology from like, I guess, rigor of argument that you expect? Is that the kind of thing that gets, I don't know, watered down or maybe dismissed, or that the standards get lowered in a way? Is it more than that?
Yeah, I think the standards get lowered in several ways. One is just the level of argumentation. So, uh, uh, giving some anecdotal evidence. So I once reviewed, psychologist and I, Josh Grubb, has once reviewed Kate Mann's book on entitlement. But this is just an example. In fairness to her, the book it was not meant to be, I think, an academic monograph. It was meant to be something more popular. So I think the standards do go down. However, she's a tenured professor at Cornell and writing on, entitlement, a topic about which there's a massive psychological literature. The book doesn't explain what entitlement is. Several reviewers pointed this out. Oliver Trolley also pointed this out in his review. The book doesn't explain what entitlement is. It looks like there's actually two different definitions or conceptions of entitlement going on in the book. And all of the argumentation for the prevalence and harms of entitlement for men in the book are just anecdotes. It's just stories. And one of them, one of the big points of argument in the book is drawn from a TV show, HBO's TV show, The Girls, or whatever it's called, Girls, something like that. So this, like, a script from an HBO show is supposed to be evidence of some actual real world phenomenon. Okay. Now, look, this is more interesting to read. I don't begrudge her for trying to be entertaining, but if a conservative tried to publish something like that, arguing, I don't know, families are good, and it's just a bunch of interviews with their friends or something like that, like, or like, oh, I watched this episode of Little House on the Prairie and Family Matters. I'm like, hey, family's good, no serious book editor, no reviewers are gonna let this pass. So sometimes it's just the level of argument. Sometimes it's the reliance on cherry picked empirical data. I think Kate Mann is also very guilty of. She's on my mind recently because she recently wrote a blog post arguing that her daughter shouldn't have kids or something. It's bad to have children. So um, yeah, so I've been thinking about, these kinds of standards. So one is just the level of argumentation. Two is just the reliance on empirical data. I tweeted about this recently. There was this movement in philosophy and psychology. It's largely, I think, died out now, but it was popular in the early 2000s, especially called situationism. And situationism basically says that subtle situational, and surprising features of our environments have outsized effects on our behavior. And so actually, as it turns out, people are not really compassionate. People are not really courageous. They're compassionate and courageous in very specific situations where it's conducive for them to do so. But no one's cross-situationally, or very few people are cross-situationally or globally morally virtuous. Say. And then this got transmuted into a claim about moral responsibility. So it turns out, if our situations are having this outside effect on our behavior, looks like we're not really responsible for what we do, so we shouldn't hold people accountable for what they do. Okay, so I think of this as like progressive catnip, so like, oh, no one's really good or bad. It's like there's, it's all our bad institutions or bad environment. And also people aren't really, even hardened criminals are not really responsible for what they do because, they were in bad situations. But if you look back at the early studies that were being used to promote these conclusions, one of the earliest was Eisen Levin paper from 1974, I think. If I had you guess how many subjects were in this study, you might already know this. Sorry, but you want to guess how many subjects are in this study?
Oh, I couldn't even begin to guess. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the paper, but I'm interested.
It's 14. So the N was, I think it was 14, 12 or 14, something like that. Okay, so imagine a conservative trying to push some conservative line with a bunch of progressive reviewers or liberal reviewers or whatever, trying to get these things through. And, they're like, oh, actually, it turns out reading to your kids, keeps them out of prison or something like that. And like the subject, size was like 12 people or something like that. Paper's not getting published, and it's surely not launching an entire research agenda that lasted probably about 20 years. I mean, it dates back to the 50s, but it was really big in philosophy and in psychology in the early 2000s for about 20 years. So that's another example. I had this other gripe about, academics, philosophers in particular, using like political examples of like all their political examples are of their opponents. So if you want to know, if you want someone doing a bad thing, an example of a politician doing a bad thing, always make that person a Republican. Always make that person someone right-leaning. What does that do? Well, it probably sends a thrill up their leg when they're writing it. It probably makes them feel good. But it also sends a message to the reviewers and the editors of journals and books that you're on the right team, right? You have the right politics. So even on a topic that's sort of like could go either way, like for example, grandstanding. Someone could have written the grandstanding paper in book, and it was only right-leaning example, and that would show a reviewer like, hey, I know this topic could go either way, like. But I'm a friend, I'm a friend. I'm only accusing Trump of this or, Paul Ryan or whatever, when he was Speaker of the House. Which is why in the book, we tried very hard. I think we even counted every example. Every other example is like Democrats or Republicans, right or left. I think I'm grandstanding by bragging about that, but yeah, so that's another thing, evidently editors and reviewers don't have a problem with it. Like if it's a paper on one of these topics, you can lower the guard of your peer reviewers by comforting them by telling them, oh, I'm on your team. This topic might be something that you might not like, but let me assuage your worries from the outset. Often these things occur on the very first page. So yeah, those are three things that that I think play into these selective demands for rigor. I'm sure there's others. We could probably figure out some more if we wanted to.
So it's let's see if I can sort of parse out at least some of what the complaints are. I mean, one seems to be that, well, you tell me, but here's the sense that I get is like, one is that there's just this call for basic fairness, that if you're going to criticize maybe like one whole entire political group or signal in that way or some sense, that you should apply those same standards to the in group or whatever it is, the other group, let's say, or all groups, let's say, universalize that in some way. And then I guess another one is that, like, well, just like you said, the standard for rigor needs to be across the board, not applied to one group and not the other. And then maybe also that your point on like viewpoint diversity needs to be upheld as well, that if you're going to I don't know, publish X amount of articles, or again, using social media, like if you're going to give critiques or something, or represent, these viewpoints, that at least represent the other side as well, or something like that. So like, that there is more of a representation of the viewpoints that are out there, maybe in the general population or something. But I don't know, that I'm kind of like trying to summarize like a couple points there. Like, is that part of the thrust of the critique of academia writ large in a way?
Well, I have many critiques of academia writ large. Yeah, I think the viewpoint diversity thing, I don't think my view, I have to think about it more. I don't think my view is that viewpoint diversity is intrinsically good. I don't think that's my view. I think two things are going on that I really care about and worry about with respect to viewpoint diversity. Three things. One, I think there's a basic issue of justice, because I think, and we know this because academics will admit it, they will literally say in a survey, I discriminate against conservatives in hiring, admission, and grants and publishing. They'll just say it. 30 to 40% of academics will say that they do that. And it might even be higher for social desirability bias. People will say things they think that, surveyor wants to hear. So I'm actually not quite sure which way that goes with academics. Like, are they undercutting their intent to discriminate or overestimating it? Anyway, we know that this happens. Every once in a while, I'll have an academic say on social media, I don't want conservatives in academia. And I'll say, I sincerely appreciate you being honest about that. Because some people deny that there's discrimination, and it's good when people like you, and I'm being sincere. It's good when people like you admit that you discriminate. That's good. So there's a sort of basic issue of justice or fairness with respect to viewpoint diversity. I don't think you can just simply look at the makeup of an academic discipline, and say that injustice has occurred. Partly because some academic disciplines are only geared towards one political sort of persuasion. So, for example, most women's and gender studies departments, there's no reason why there are conservatives who work on gender or sex or women's politics and so on. There are conservatives who work on those things. But every conservative knows, like if those departments, women, gender, sexuality departments, if they advertise a job, there's no point. There's no point in applying because it's basically the left wing equivalent of something like Rush Limbaugh study. Like, if you have a department of Rush Limbaugh studies, okay, if you're a, blue haired progressive, like this is not, they're not going to hire you. Now, of course, there is no right wing equivalent of these departments. And so, like if your entire discipline is geared towards a certain political persuasion, it of course makes sense to only hire people who agree with you. Like if all the presuppositions of your, think about the feminist philosophy journal, Hypatia. The entire journal is devoted to feminism, which I don't have a problem with, except that they don't publish criticisms of feminism. There might be, it might publish internecine disputes among feminists, but there's no like right wing publications in Hypatia. Again, whatever, that's fine. I think that's not a real academic discipline, right? If you're not allowing external critique. So one problem with the lack of viewpoint diversity is just there are entire disciplines that are politically motivated ideological playgrounds for people. I think there's the justice issue and discrimination in hiring and admissions and so on. I also think in the big, one of my big gripes is just the epistemic problems with lack of diversity, both in the classroom and in research. So, I have a lot of lefty friends who assure me that, right-wing views are taught fairly and charitably in classrooms. And I have no doubt that many of my friends do it justice. I think I have some, respectable, honest friends on the left that do that. But I also know what goes on. And I've seen the syllabi in other departments, other disciplines. I know, students tell me what goes on in other disciplines and other departments. And so I know, as a matter of course, conservative or right-wing views are not being taught at all, or when they are taught, it's sort of like wink, wink, like we all know, this is garbage, that sort of thing. And I think in the epistemic commons, that's a very bad outcome, especially when it comes to higher ed and research, teaching young people. So, my friend Rishi Joshi, who I've already mentioned, he's got this great paper called The Epistemic Significance of Social Pressure. So if you have an epistemic environment in which certain views are strong social pressure against certain views being expressed, you should lower your confidence in any of the sort of scholarly outcomes of that discipline. For what are basically million reasons. You're not getting a full sort of evidence base. You're basically cordoning off an entire, a priori, you're cordoning off an entire selection of potential pieces of evidence. So I think perhaps my biggest concern about viewpoint diversity is the epistemic considerations. It's bad for research. It's bad for teaching. I don't think that you need an equal. I'm not one of these we need 40% of the country's conservative, therefore 40% of the faculty have to be conservative. I don't think that's right. For lots of reasons, good and bad, a lot of conservatives self-select out of academia. And I don't think we should be I'm not affirmative action for conservatives. I don't think you should lower your standards to get conservatives. Luckily, I think you don't have to. And there are lots of people that just get kicked out of academia and never get hired, who are exceptional scholars, exceptional philosophers. But their CV didn't pass the spell test, and they were never able to get in.
Okay, good. I want to touch on, I think that's helpful. I want to touch on one of those points, which is that at least some measure of conservatives self-select out of academia. And I want to ask the question why, and maybe a lead up to that. The most recent stats that I found on the breakdown of political party among philosophers was something I think 2008, and it was Eric Schwitzgebel. And I think the numbers were something it was in the 80% Democrat, 80 some percent at least. And it was maybe like 7% Republican or something like that. And I mean, cards on the table, like I think there's a helpful distinction between let's say liberal principles, conservative principles, and then the actual state of affairs in the political scene that goes on. So I want to put that on the table too. But my question really is, in your mind, what explains such a huge, massive difference in philosophy departments in particular? I mean, academia we could talk about at large, but I really am interested in why is this so the case in philosophy? Because well, there's the political party affiliation question, but there's also the other question that you touched on, which is just the consistency with the philosophical principles that you teach ordinarily, you know, irrespective of like political party. You know, you're teaching logic, you're teaching rigor, you're teaching conceptual analysis, you're teaching about good arguments, and then all of a sudden, many of those principles get compromised when you talk about politics, and that has always just so confused me. So I know I'm sort of like rambling here, but maybe if I can focus on the what explains the huge gap problem, maybe we can get into the other issues later.
This is a difficult question. There's a great book by two political scientists called Passing on the Right. I forget their names, so I apologize. Can give them credit, but it's a really nice book, and it was written probably 12 years ago or so. I don't think much has changed empirically since they wrote the book, but they were trying to do two things. One is make the case that there's this difference in the makeup of the professoriate along the political lines. There's a lot of great anecdotes there about people just telling their stories about some crazy things that would never fly if the politics are reversed. And then I think they offer three potential explanations for this. I don't think there's a single explanation. I don't know if I can remember everything they say, but the thought is something like, first, there is some self-selection. And I think some self-selection is for understandable, perfectly fine, acceptable reasons, and some self-selection is bad. So the bad self-selection is, I think, a lot of undergraduate, grad students who are right-leaning or, right curious or something, don't go into academia because they can read the room. They know, students are, we get on their case for not reading and not paying attention, not coming to class, but they're pretty astute when it comes to how their professors talk about politics, the things they prioritize. So, for example, after Trump won the second election, I had a lot of philosophy professors like, I'm canceling the day's activities, and we're just going to have, a kumbaya session to like talk about our feelings and this, And I just thought this was like a massive dereliction of your professional duty. I think you wouldn't be okay with this if a right-leaning professor canceled class to have a pizza party in celebration over the election. And I think it seems pretty obvious to me, but they see themselves as like, well, these are my little babies. I'm mommy professor and daddy professor, and I have to sort of like coddle my little ones to make sure they're safe and so on. And I think this is extremely irresponsible and unprofessional. But students pick up on that. Like they're not like, oh, I guess they're just being nice to me or something. No, they understand the double standard. They understand that their professors constantly talk about Trump, constantly talk about fascism or whatever it is. When it's not relevant to the course material, they can read the room. So a lot of smart undergrads who are right-leaning decide, why would I want to try to break into a profession that's just going to treat me like this? Why would I want to break into a profession? This is how they act. This is how they treat people. And so I'll just go practice law, or I'll go work on Capitol Hill, or I'll become a journalist, or I'll start a business, or I'll build kitchen tables, or whatever it is. I think that kind of self-selection is bad because what they've seen is this place is not going to be welcoming to people like me. And I had enough problems. I don't want to go join a career that's going to be a headache for me, and I'm just going to be disliked by my colleagues all the time. Like, some of us are gluttons for punishment and chosen anyway, but it's not for everybody. And I think that's bad. That a lot of people just self-select out for those reasons. Some of the self-selection is fine, right? I think one of the theories quoted in this Passing on the Right book is that um, people on the left are more likely to see higher education and uh, the freedom that comes with research and as a kind of vocation or a calling, partly because it comes down to politics. So there's a kind of activist bent that academia allows you to have. You don't have a boss really. I mean, you got your summers off. You can write whatever you want. You have a captive audience for 3 or 6 hours a week to just tell them. So I think it does um, appeal to a certain kind of activist cast of mind, and particularly a kind of leftist uh, activist cast of mind that sees the world in terms of you know you teach ideas to change the world, right? It's not to like impart wisdom or knowledge or understanding. Like the goal of education is to like start a revolution. And conservatives, on average, tend to be less interested in that kind of calling. So I think that's a reason. There is some data that suggests that people on the left have higher IQs than people on the right. Uh, that may be, I am not afraid of empirical data. So if that turns out, that's fine. And so if that were true, then it wouldn't be surprising that, on the left, there would be more people in academia. I don't think there's anything to be embarrassed about that. I don't think that shows anything. I think people who do want to make the IQ point about conservatives are wading into very dangerous territory if they follow that line of reasoning further. Say no more. Uh, and then I think, I do think a big reason why there's so many leftists and Democrats in philosophy, especially, is at a certain tipping point, when I think academia has always been leaning left or mostly left. It has always been so. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower was the president of Columbia. It's hard to imagine a Republican president now being a president of an Ivy League institution. That's sort of, when Ben South was chosen as president of Florida, that was sort of like, all my academic friends were like, what? He's not, he's got a PhD from Yale, but, there was something like, oh, what is he doing? Like, what is he doing on our turf? Like, how dare they? So I do think things have changed. But once you get a certain tipping point, you have, you know, majority of disciplines, majority of administrators, majority of presidents, provosts that are left leaning. It just becomes extremely easy to discriminate and hire your own people. And in a way, I understand it. Like, I, it's tough. It's tough working with and around people who disagree with you about the things you care about most. And lots of times, we can still be friends. And I have working relationships with a lot of people who disagree with my politics and think I'm gross or icky or whatever. But it does grind you down. And so you do have to kind of have a secret group of, you have to have your own gang kind of in the group chat to kind of keep you buoyed. But it's difficult. And so but once you get a tipping point, it's just very easy to hire your own people and this is, this person, he's not one of us. He's not my kind of person. And academics are very good. They have a very good sniffer when it comes to your CV. Like they'll pick out, paper on immigration, where you argue for one particular immigration restriction. Like, you shouldn't letting, gang members or something. Oh, that's really, I don't know. That's not really our kind of guy. So academics are very good at that. We're very good at picking out, finding wrong think and sniffing that stuff out. So I think those are the main reasons. There is discrimination. There is some self-selection. And I think it might be that on average, leftists are smarter than right-wingers. Yeah, that might explain part of it too.
Good. I want to touch on the point that I mentioned earlier and that we sort of circled around a little bit, but that distinction between, well, maybe one way of asking it is, what do you have in mind when you're thinking of left and right? Because again, I want to distinguish those principles from like either side or whatever, distinguish that from the actual people and what goes on currently today. And like, I mean, cards on the table, I look at both sides of the aisle and I go, I dislike, let's say, 99% of the rhetoric and what goes on both sides. Having said that, I can understand, I guess, as a philosopher, more about like the principles. So having discussions on like that level. So when you're addressing left and right, what do you typically have in mind? Is it both? I mean, like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I don't think of when I use the terms left and right or progressive or liberal or conservative or right leaning, left leaning, I'm not particularly thinking about like the politics of what Oakeshott called the politics of the moment. So who the politicians are that may be maybe not offensively representing some sort of set of ideas. So, often you'll see someone say something like, "Oh, we need more conservatives in academia," and they'll say like, "Oh, like you want more, or like you want Trump, you want more Trump people." No, I'm not saying we shouldn't want that. I'm just saying that's not what I mean. And well, oh, you want like flat earthers and creationists. I once met this Republican who was a flat earther, and you want more of that. Um, no, that's not the claim. So when I think of left and right spectrum, I mean, I don't think the left and right spectrum is all that helpful. I think there are lots of political views that don't fall on that spectrum. Um, but the sort of biggest change I would say, or the biggest distinction I would say between the right and the left are those who, on the left, who have a certain view of the individual and individual levels of freedom. So this would be like liberals, radical libertarians, a lot of progressives, radical view of individual freedom, skepticism of authority structures and the state and any kind of hierarchies, um, who have kind of an ideal theory of politics. They've imagined a utopia in their mind. So whether it's, Marx said it wasn't a utopia, it was. So yeah, imagining a Marxian utopia or a socialist utopia or a libertarian utopia or a liberal utopia, involves, and like the goal of politics is to kind of like reach those utopias. A lot of people on the left have grand theories of history. So, Martin Luther King Jr. said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So that's a view that it's inevitable that we're making moral progress, that sort of thing. People who are caught up in a sense of we will win, like our views are on the right side of history. A view that wants to sort of unshackle us from custom and superstition and tradition and religion. It's a big conglomerate of things that I would call left leaning. And then on the right, there are, in my view, not all right wingers think like this, but a lot of what I think of when I talk about conservatives or right leaning people or people who are skeptical of human reason. This is another reason why you might think conservatives don't end up in philosophy is I think conservatives tend to have a more, in my view, realistic view of what human reason can accomplish. So, Rawls down in his office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and identified the two principles of justice for all ancient Babylonians were like, oh, ancient Babylonians, you got it wrong. You didn't have the theory of justice. Conservatives are pretty skeptical that we can just sit around and think about identify these things. So and I think conservatives are more pessimistic about human nature. Unlike people on the left, like Rousseau, Marxists, who think that psychology is very plastic, that people are bad because of bad institutions. People on the right tend to think, no, we're pretty bad. There are some saints and there are some, really evil people, but most of us are in the middle or worse. And it's only because that our families and society and the state civilize us that we can have a life together, and we should be anxious to preserve those things. Conservatives are going to tend to more care about family and making babies and being religious and, caring about uh, freedom of association and these sorts of things. So, it's a constellation of things that I think cluster on the left and the right. I don't think there's any super clean way to distinguish these things, but that's what I mean. And so, um, yeah, I don't particularly have in mind politicians or the politics of the moment. I have in mind a certain set of impulses or ideas or judgments about political life together that tend to cluster together. And academics tend to be on the left side of things. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah, it definitely is helpful. It reminds me, so less on principles and more on policy. I once heard a podcaster, Chris Williamson. He puts it like this, where if let's say you're talking to a philosopher, and well, no, scratch that. Let's say you're talking to anybody, and they give you one of their sort of political views. Maybe it's gun control, whatever it is. And he says, look, if I know one of your political views and then I can derive the entire rest of your political views from that one, I don't consider you to be a serious thinker.
Mhm.
Is there something to that? Agree, disagree?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this. So I keep mentioning my friend Rishi Joshi. He should like pay me some like royalties after this. He's got a great paper. We were colleagues for 3 years here at Bowling Green. He's out in Arizona, but he's got this great paper. What are the chances that you're right about everything? And I'll come back to that in a moment. This reminds me though. I often early on with my students, if I'm teaching a class on political philosophy or PPE or something, I'll say, a lot of us naturally, obviously, we think we're right about things. Otherwise, we wouldn't have our beliefs if we didn't think we were right about it. But what are the chances that, like, all of your beliefs about politics and morality are correct? Like, all of human history, all these people, everyone had, like, some false beliefs. And, like, human history's been leading to this point in 2025. And, like, you, 19-year-old, me, where history's been leading to us. And we finally identified history will keep, it'll keep going, like, but we really nailed it. Like, what are the chances? And I think the chances are pretty low. I think that's a good exercise in humility for students early on in the semester. Rishi's point is that a lot of the political views that we have clustered over time for reasons that largely don't have to do with epistemic concerns. So it's not that the ideas hang together cohesively. Like you could tell a just so story that makes, gun control, abortion, immigration, like trans stuff, whether we should colonize the moon or like Mars or something like AI, like we have all these views and they cluster together largely for reasons that have to do with, political viability. So getting a party together that can get coalitions that can win. Some of these are social reasons. So you might agree with your friends about lots of things, but then you find yourself out of step about issue X. And so you sort of like work your way up to agreeing with issue X. And so his view is that, or his suspicion is that a lot of people's political views are arrived at through maybe not the best epistemic means. And he makes a similar point, which is that I often tell my students this too. Like you tell me your views on abortion, immigration, I can get your views on basically everything else. Okay. So I think there's something right about this. However, I do think I don't think it's just what philosophers call a past dependent. I don't think it's just a past dependent story about why these views have clustered together. I think you might call it a just so story, but I think you can give a principled explanation for why someone who has a certain cast of mind would both be pro-life and anti-open borders. I think there is a certain psychological construct or a certain cast of mind that would lead someone to believe those two things. I don't know what it is, but I suspect that there is a set of dispositions and views about the world that would lead someone to believe it. So, long answer to your question, I think there's certainly some predictive truth in Williamson's point. You can do these things. And then there's the sort of epistemic question is whether this is bad or not. And then there's this sort of maybe psychological or deep philosophical question about whether, what explains, is there a deeper story to tell than just like, well, all my philosophy friends believe this, and so I want to fit in. It's all going up, under the level of consciousness. Usually, sort of belief forming mechanisms. You're not always transparent to it. So yeah, I'm of two minds about this. I think there's some truth to this, but I also think, if God told us the full story of political psychology, there'd probably be some deeper principles.
A couple of the, I guess, political issues most recently that sort of illustrated this point was the issues of masks and vaccines. Because for me, when those were brought up during the lockdown, during the COVID era, my prediction was, when I was hearing about everything, was that on the left, given the principles of choice and freedom, that masks would not be such a big issue, and that the freedom to abstain from vaccines is going to sort of overrule whatever concerns happen. And clearly, I was just so completely wrong on that sort of thing. But I guess my question is, what was I not seeing when I predicted that? When the mask issues started coming up, I predicted one thing, it turned out the opposite. When the vaccine issues, I predicted one thing, the total opposite happened. What was I missing from that in your mind?
I don't know if you're missing anything. I don't know. I didn't study COVID and its responses as much as a lot of people. And it's also like, 5 years ago, I'm already forgetting that, like, we went through this traumatic experience. Like, just kind of blocked that out of my mind. But what were you missing? Well, I think a couple things went on. One is, if you look really early at the responses to COVID on the Democratic left, there were these, like, I think Nancy Pelosi went to like a Chinese cultural festival in San Francisco, and where all these people were like worried about COVID, and like, Trump had been talking about like travel bans or something, and like she was like, no, go out and party, have a great time, don't be afraid of this. There was this, I think, initial impulse to not let COVID kind of like spoil the party and spoil your freedom. I think that was an initial impulse. I also remember arguing with some academics about face masks. And I remember early on some leftist acquaintances in philosophy, very good lefty credentials, saying masks don't work, masks are useless, there's no reason to have these. It was very early on. And I'm just some, like dumb, like hick, I'm like, well, I don't know. They kind of like stop, like doctors use them. So maybe like they do something. I don't know. I don't know what masks do or don't do, but I just kind of found this weird that, like, I don't know, like maybe they work, maybe they don't. But I thought it was interesting that all of a sudden these philosophers were criticizing the use of masks. Of course, that's changed like dramatically. I think what happened, or if you have missed anything, I think what happened was largely negative polarization around Trump. So I think, Trump started talking about travel bans. And I think he started taking a more lax view towards these things. And some of the Republicans governors like DeSantis to Florida had a very lax, as things went, a relatively lax policy about COVID. And I think the left thought, well, I think maybe it's unfair. I don't think this is too unfair. I think a lot of the left, and the right is too, the left, like the reasoning is this: Trump said X or did X. If Trump does X, then X is wrong or false. Then therefore I must, accept not X or something. So I think that's basically the level of sort of argumentation that went along. So Trump was talking about lab leaks. and of course, well, that can't be right because he said it. So it has to be, and that was supposed to be racist, but like eating animals from a wet market, like that wasn't racist, as many people, I don't know how that's not racist, like, or like more racist or something. I don't know. So I think a lot of it was just negative polarization. People saw what Trump and the right was doing, uh, and thought, well, we have to differentiate ourselves from these things, which must be wrong and have to be uh, false. And so we're just going to do the opposite. And so I think that was a lot of it. I think that was that. I don't think that was all of it, but I think that motivated a lot of people to perhaps give up some of their principles. Now, in fairness to liberals, there are, for most liberals, there are legitimate restrictions on freedom from the government, and pandemics are presumably one of these things. But the level of like closing down playgrounds, you see these pictures of like people playing trombones with like a mask around their mouthpiece, and like, you know, uh, and so people at restaurants like putting their mask down to take a bite and then putting it back up to chew, I think a lot of that was negative polarization and also just signaling. I mean, it became a way to show that you care among a certain group of people. It became a way to show that you care. And one, I'm a pretty cynical person about politics in general. I think a lot of politics is just signaling, and trying to show you're on the right team and that identifying who your friends and enemies are. I think these are all things that we do a lot. And so, and I think principles don't always have the same motivational oomph as the desire to feel accepted and show out how good you are. So I don't know if you missed anything, Jared. It's just that, it was a weird time. And, you know, I love my parents. They were wiping down their groceries, with like Clorox wipes, and I don't blame them. Like that's just kind of what, people were doing. And, it was a weird time.
I want to get to your point on signaling and segue into grandstanding in a minute, but it was interesting, that you started out with the comment. For myself as well, I think much of my world has thankfully moved on from a lot that happened in that era. And I can say more about that. But what's interesting is that so I'd like to get your take, at least when I teach, I have noticed that there are many implications and ramifications socially from what happened during that era for the students. So the classroom to me just seems different than it did in 2019. And it prompts me to ask, how do you approach teaching, I guess, especially on controversial issues? Do you try? So I've, on this podcast in particular, I've advocated for, at least myself, and a few others have sort of weighed in on this, but that I do try to teach as quote unquote neutrally as possible, where I present both sides of an argument. I try to give the students as complete information as possible on an issue so that they can form the judgments. But how do you approach the classroom given your concerns about academia?
Yeah. I think there are at least three ways to approach these issues. One is a bad way, in my view, which is just to be an ideologue and just teach all the things that you think are true, teach them as true. Don't pretend that other views are serious contenders or that smart people believe them. Just be an ideologue about it. I think a lot of people teach that way. I think some of them know they're doing it and don't care. That's what they think teaching is. Teaching is, it's the pedagogy of the oppressed, right? You're teaching, you're overcoming the bad ideology, you're destroying the fascists, whatever. I think some people do it knowingly. I think some people do it but don't know they're doing it. I think there are some people who think they're being fair or would tell you they're being fair, but are deeply self-deceived about that. Okay, so I think that's a bad way to do it. I think there are two more respectable, more noble ways of teaching these issues. Um, One way is to do your best to be quote unquote neutral, to teach the ideas, arguments, um, and yet to tell your students your views. So I've had people say things like, you know, I teach the ideas, I teach a diversity of ideas, but I also tell my students what I believe. Um, I think that's better than like the pure like indoctrination ideological strategy. I think there's something honorable about that because it comes from a good place. You're trying to let your students check your bias. So they're able to sort of like say, oh, he went kind of hard against that view. Maybe, maybe it's because he believes the opposite. And I've been told that, and I know that. And so I can sort of like gauge that. That's not my strategy. I respect the strategy. But I don't think it fits my personality or my view of teaching. And I think there are also some big dangers in it too. The strategy that I prefer, it sounds like maybe this is what you do too, is I think of teaching as acting. It's largely acting. And when I teach Marx, I'm Marx. Like, now I'll be intellectually honest if a student says, like, what's an objection to this? I'll explain the objection, or like, here's what someone would say, or here's what someone could say, and here's what Marx would say in reply. But I think of teaching as it's in many ways, it's acting. And you have to, again, this is just my view, you have to check some of your own personality and views at the door. And so, and I think I do this pretty well. I've had some academic, when these questions of neutrality come up online, like, I once had a guy months ago say, I said, look, I really am neutral. I just teach the ideas and I go hard in the paint for those ideas, whether I agree with them or not. I pride myself on that because in that moment, I am Mark. Like, I'm not Brandon Warmke, right-wing bigot, right? Or, fascist or whatever. Like, I'm just doing my thing and I'm being Mark. And I had someone say, oh, I'm sure you believe that, but I'm sure you're just a hack, a right-wing hack in the classroom. And I don't think that's true. I think my students would tell me if they thought that were true. I don't think I would get the conversations and responses that I get if that were true. But maybe I'm self-deceived about that. But I do think this is a superior for people who can do it. I don't think everyone can pull it off. And I know that sounds self-serving, but here's one of the benefits that I think this has over the second view, which is like tell your students your view. I think once you tell your students your views, a wall goes up. A wall goes up, and either they think, either a wall or like, oh, this is my guy, like I trust him and he has my views, and so I don't need to like challenge. Like, he'll tell me what the truth is. I can trust him, and I don't really want to be trusted in that way. I want to be trusted to sort of like be a reliable testifier to the ideas, the arguments that I'm presenting. And so I think and I also think walls can go up. If you tell, especially if you tell your students you're a right-leaning person, I think a lot of students would appreciate that. But there are students that I would like to reach with philosophy who might otherwise say, oh, okay, well, I don't have anything to learn from this person. And I want to try to prevent that. I think that's an obstacle to education. And so now, of course, I'm under no illusions that my students don't Google me or find out my Twitter or see what I've written. I'm under no illusions of that. But what I want them to think is, at least in this classroom, that stuff doesn't matter. And that we're doing a different sort of thing here. We have a different kind of business to attend to. And I want them to trust me to attend to that business responsibly with them. So I am always comfortable. I mean, my students will often ask me, like, what do I think? Like, what's my view? And I don't tell them. I'll say, well, here's an objection. Or, I do think intellectual honesty sometimes requires saying, well, I don't think this objection is the best or a good one, but here's something that they could say. Or, yeah, that, that people have raised empirical concerns about this view or whatever. Like, I think intellectual honesty sometimes requires saying things like that. But it has to be balanced out with a certain sort of, attention to the philosophical state of play, which is not just giving you what I think. And so sometimes students get frustrated. Now, I will say this, um, and this has happened many times, and it happens to many of my friends who are on the right. I think students very early on can tell that a professor is a conservative, even if they say nothing about their views. And the reason you're shaking your head because I think you know what I'm about to say is they know that if you teach this way, chances are you're not on the left, because all they hear from so many of their professors are their political views. They hear, oh, Trump, can you believe what Trump did? Or Republicans in the state destroyed this education bill. Can you believe it? And they hear it and they know, and they immediately, they know what's going on. And when you don't do that, it kind of like, it's kind of like shocking. Like, well, why aren't they telling me about their personal views about the politics of the day? They must. And they developed over time a sensitivity to this, and they know it. So I actually am I'm under no obligation, no illusions that my students, many of them don't know what I think. But I do think there is a kind of benefit to it being an open secret. I think the secret part is important. There's a benefit to it being, and showing them that you can actually check these things in a kind of educational context where I think it would be inappropriate to influence my students in this way. Because I think, if you read like the 1914 AAU principles of tenured academic freedom, one of the things it says in there is that teachers should not take advantage of their students' immaturity. And I think one way to take advantage of your students' immaturity is to have these little snide remarks and comments. And I think that's a way to take advantage of them. And it's not indoctrination in the most obvious ways, but it's a subtle form of social pressure. And I know they've told me a lot of students feel pressure to agree with the professor or not criticize the professor and so on. So yeah, that's kind of how I handle it. I mean, I know a lot of people probably disagree with that approach to the classroom. I have respect for many of those who disagree, but I don't have patience for, and I think a dereliction of duty is professors who treat their classes simply as a way to get their students to believe what they believe is the truth about some moral matter or political matter. I mean, I've seen syllabi on, professor teaching, sex or gender or something, and there's literally no dissenting view. So, I think that's bad.
Yeah, it's telling that intentional neutrality, as far as you can do it, is a signal in some sense. Because I mean, I think many people overplay the power dynamics card in many situations, but I do think that it's there in the classroom, and I have, just like you said, I think I have like respect for that sort of thing. Now, I have I couldn't have put it better. I have the exact same approach in the classroom. I do see it as an ethical matter, how you approach students in the classroom, just like you said. So if I'm teaching on consequentialism, and I'm not a consequentialist, then I'm going to advocate for that. I'm going to steel man that position. And if there are objections, I'm going to try my best, just like you said, playing the role of the consequentialist. If it's natural law, if it's social contract theory, whatever it is, I'm going to try to give it the best pitch and defense as I possibly can. I'm curious, so I tell my students my approach the first day of class, whatever class I'm teaching, that this is the way that I'm going to approach these topics. Do students know your approach, or how do you handle that?
Yeah. I do the first day of class. I read to them something that I put in the syllabus, and I stole this from Robbie George, philosopher at Princeton, and it's a statement on academic freedom and uh, free speech or something. I can't remember what he titles it, but it's and I read it to them. Sometimes I read it to them twice because I want them to have a very clear view of what this class is about and what I'm not going to tolerate and what is allowed. So, and I don't remember all the details, but it's basically that this institution respects free inquiry and free speech. We operate in the currency of reasons and arguments and ideas. No ideas or arguments are out of bounds as long as you give an argument. We're not going to silence people. We're not going to make fun of people. We're not going to, do this sort of sort of emotional pleas, in the classroom. And I say, look, this is how this classroom is going to be run. If you don't like it, that's okay. I don't, no shade, but this class may not be for you. And I started doing this several years ago. I had a really bad interaction in class, not so much with me and a student, but a student with another student. And a student was demanding that I deal with the student's views. It wasn't even a view he expressed. It was a question, and this other student just sort of lost it. And I actually had to file a complaint with the dean because, I'm not going to deal with this semester. You need to deal with this person, or I'm going to drop this person. And so if someone wants to behave like that in class, I'm sure there are other classes that they can get away with that, but it's just not going to be mine. And so I don't say exactly that I don't tell my students my views, because then I think I'm sort of thematizing it, and now they're like, well, what are his views? But I do think setting the tone with respect to sort of free inquiry and letting them know, and I've had many students thank me for that, and I'm sure some don't appreciate it, but I do. My experience has been that the room chills out. Everyone's like, okay, we all agree that we're not gonna sigh or laugh or make fun of or dunk on someone in class. We're all agreed that we're not going to do that, and then it just sort of makes it a very free and more enjoyable classroom environment. So that's one thing I do. Yeah. So one worry I do have that when I'm thinking about my pedagogy, one worry I do have, I take this seriously, is that when you teach the way that I do, it sounds like you do too, that you implicitly communicate to your students that there's no fact of the matter, or it's really hard. It's really hard to tell, and so it's at the end of the day, you sort of inspire a kind of radical skepticism about philosophical progress or about whether we can know these things. And I take that very seriously. I think we don't want to implicitly or explicitly communicate to students it's just a game we play. We're just with a game argument. At the end of the day, we go home and make dinner, and that's it. And I try to combat this in a way by expanding their notion of what philosophical progress is. So philosophical progress can just be a greater sense of understanding of something. Philosophical progress can be maybe not changing your view, but maybe lowering or increasing your confidence in a view. That's philosophical progress. And so, I take this criticism very seriously, because the last thing I would want for my students, I guess if they end up becoming radical skeptic, that's a view too. So maybe I shouldn't be, try to not. But I am sensitive to the idea that it's easy to convince someone that this level of thinking is useless or a waste of our time because I didn't at the end of the semester give them all the answers. That's something that I want to guard against. So, but I totally see the criticism.
Generally speaking, so I'm interested in how how you have incorporated psychology into your work. And particularly as we're talking, I'm interested in, as you looked at the psychological studies data on narcissism in particular, How did that inform some of your work in ethics?
Yeah. I had, I, I started my master's degree in philosophy at Northern Illinois. I didn't have a background in philosophy, and so I wasn't getting into any PhD programs. With a degree from, I went to a place called Moody Bible Institute. You know, PhD programs were not letting me in after that. So I went and did a master's degree, and I encountered this professor. His name is Mike Bishop. He's now at Florida State, and I actually started my PhD at Florida State, and I had him at Florida State. Well, he had a profound impact on me. I disagree with a lot of his conclusions, but um, he took psychology very seriously, and uh, and I thought that was I was convinced that a lot of philosophers make empirical claims about human psychology that may or may not be backed by our best empirical evidence. And so at the time, I didn't really do much. I mean, I wrote some papers on situationism at the time, but I didn't really have much to. I was writing mostly on forgiveness through my PhD. But when it came time to write on the grandstanding stuff, I got a little Mike Bishop on my shoulder, being like, "Well, what do the psychologists say?" Now, I have to say, a lot of psychology, especially social psychology, has just been pummeled by, the replication crisis, bad studies, the file drawer problem, all the negative results just get locked in a drawer, never published. And so you're not getting a full sort of view of the evidence base. Um, so, and we knew that going in, we knew the problems with social psych. I mean, some areas of psychology had done better, like personality psychology has actually done quite well in replicating, and a lot of valid constructs, Big Five, IQ, these are pretty powerful tools. Social psychology has been, in my view, largely driven by personalities and cult of personality, and what can get you, a TED talk or a massive book advance. And so, social psychology is just a wasteland of things that were fads for a while and then not replicated. And so Justin Tosi, my co-author, and I went into this thinking, we're talking about, we're claiming there's this phenomenon, status seeking, and people use discourse to seek status and impress others and so on. We're making an empirical claim that people do this. And so when we're telling our story about why people do this, it can't just be as Hume suggested, people care about how they're viewed by others, that's fine for a certain kind of philosopher, and not what we were interested in. We also knew that, because of the topic and because we weren't known as leftists or whatever, people were going to be gutting for the book, which didn't, I don't think, stop them, but we wanted to make sure we had sort of the best evidence available. There was a lot of stuff that was written that would have been useful that we didn't think was good science. And so what's in the book or what ended up in the book is stuff that we were very confident was going to hold up. And so we ran that stuff by several psychologists that we trusted to say, look, if we're relying on stuff that you don't think is high-powered studies, if you think we're relying on stuff that's going to be, not replicated, please let us know, because we're not going to put that in the book. That would be embarrassing. Just totally embarrassing. A year after you put this, a whole chapter hinges on some one paper, and then a year later, there's 5 failed replications. It's well, okay, and that's embarrassing. So everything in the book was pretty well established psychological literature. Now, maybe this stuff gets overturned at some point, but it's all pretty good science. So that was really important to us. I mean, we didn't want to rely on bad psychology. It was also important to us that we not just sort of do this kind of what do you call it, pop philosophical psychology, but from a historical figure, So it's think Nietzsche is very insightful, but Nietzsche claimed a lot of things about vanity and narcissism and status seeking, and I don't think that's enough to like hinge an empirical argument on what Nietzsche thought. Very, very insightful person, but not, uh, not enough. So that was really the motivation. I had Mike Bishop in my head. Thankfully, I'm very grateful to him for that. But I also, you know, um, I'll say this. I get self-sobering, I think, but I think being heterodox in academia. This goes back to the question of selective demands for rigor. Um, it, I don't think it's true in every case, in every philosopher, but you have to have a level of um, conscientiousness and care with your research that I think you don't have to have if you have the right political views. You should just know that like you are in their target. Like you got a target on your back, you're in the site. That book comes out, you know exactly what they're gonna do to it. And so we wrote the best book we could, in part because we wanted to, but also you just can't get by with slapdash stuff in academia. Now, there's lots of right wing talking heads out there in podcasts. You can say whatever you want, but in academia, you know, you can't just do the right wing thing and like phone it in. Even though I'm sure many people think that's what my career is, but that's okay.
I would love to talk more about that. We probably only have time for like a couple more questions, but I do want to touch on, you mentioned that a lot of your work has been on forgiveness. And to me, that just seems like one of the most, a very important topic right now, given the rise of canceling on both the right and the left. And I'm wondering what, how relevant do you see that topic? I mean, number one, I think, just just forgiving as a social phenomenon that I think needs to be applied more is number one. But number two, how can you motivate people to look more deeply into the topic of forgiveness, or maybe like what motivated you to do work in that area?
I got into forgiveness. So I brief, boring biological or biographical background. I started my PhD at Florida State, which at the time and still was a very serious place to do work on free will and moral responsibility. And so all the movers and shakers there were doing sort of free will, responsibility, agency stuff. All my friends at Florida State were, very smart people doing free will, coming up with new counterexamples to Frankfurt cases. And I thought for a time that I would get into free will. I found out that I wasn't smart enough to do free will because you have to, and I'm also too lazy. Like you have to read like hundreds and hundreds of these papers, get caught up on all the little moves in the cottage industries and the Frankfurt cases and the direct argument and their, tax evasion cases. Like it's so many things you have to learn to keep in your head at once. I'm too lazy and I don't think I'm smart enough like to come up with counterexamples to all these different views. Like every paper that I read, like the last one I read, I was like, yeah, seems right to me. And then I'd read a reply to that. Like, yeah, sounds right to me too. So I just didn't have it. I didn't have the stuff to do that. And I sort of became convinced that a lot of the action was in holding morally responsible. So a practice of blaming and punishment. So at the time, this was like late 2000s, early 2010s, blame was kind of a big deal. Like, what is blame? What's saying to blame? How it's blame different than punishment, so on. And there's a lot being written on that. And again, I'm very lazy. And so I thought, I'm going to be able to stuff on blame. I did, but I didn't want to like wade through it really seriously around it. And I discovered this at the time. It was a relatively modestly sized literature. It wasn't a big literature in analytic philosophy. And I thought, well, here's something I can master. I can read all these papers. And I also found that most people had virtually very, very similar views. There was a view of forgiveness that was very popular. And I just thought, this can't be right. And so I wrote a dissertation, and a lot of my first sort of papers that hit were on forgiveness. And I had a relatively, unique view. Uh, and so I had like a voice and something to say, and I said it. Um, and so that's like the professional story about how I got into philosophy. I was like, oh, I can get published doing this. Like, it's like shooting fish in a barrel or something. So, but the more personal, often people were like, what happened to you? Like, why did you writing on forgiveness? Like, did something happened to you that you were, and I don't think so. But I thought the professional interest in the negative aspects of responsibility practices is important, but there wasn't a lot of interest in the more positive or pro-social aspect of our responsibility practices. Things like praising, things like forgiving, showing mercy, kindness, and so that was maybe the more sort of first, biographical or personal reason that I got into the forgiveness debate is, we really care about blaming and punishing. That's fun, and but the forgiving stuff is hard. I mean, I have a very hard time forgiving. I mean, in some ways I find it very difficult. Um, and okay, so you asked about the political moment. Oh man, I don't know if I have much to say here. I mean, um, I think a lot of the acrimony and conflict among friends and coworkers and family members, a lot of that can be um, ameliorated. A lot of hurt and vengefulness. I think it can be ameliorated in lots of ways. I don't think forgiveness is the only one. So I think sometimes people make a mistake in thinking, "Oh, you want to move on, like you want me to forgive you," and maybe sometimes forgiveness is a proper response, but sometimes it's just letting things go. Um, Sometimes it's just burying the hatchet. We don't need to apologize. We don't need, there's someone in my life that I would like to reconcile with, the professional philosopher. And I'm totally willing to sort of let things go and bury the hatchet and just move on. And the other person wants, apologies and let it all out and, go through all the backstory and all this sort of stuff. And I just think that would be bad. I just think that would be, so I think sometimes you have to go through that backlog of hurt and resentment. I think sometimes that's necessary for forgiveness. I think sometimes, however, it's okay to just either move on and let things go, or to forgive without going through the the rituals. And but I think a lot of people don't want forgiveness or don't want to be forgiven. I think I harbor grudges, and it's very hard for me to give those up. Uh, so I'm probably not the best person to ask about how to apply forgiveness to these things. I mean, it's weird. In some cases, I find grudges very hard to get over. In some cases, I find it very easy, and I don't know what the difference is. Um, we're rotten, very mysterious to ourselves. So I don't know what makes those cases different. But I will say this: it makes me sad, especially when political or ideological conflicts divide friends and family members. That's really, I mean, there's some level of political acrimony you're just going to have in a democracy. It's just inevitable. But I think the ease with which people have ended friendships and ended family relationships over politics, and this is sort of trite to say, but it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it's something that has, I'm sure there's sociological data out there, but it seems like it increased exponentially in the past 5 years or so. I do want to ask about your transition, and especially, for people who know.
So, by the way, that's a funny way to introduce that my big announcement. That I'm transitioning. That's
Yeah. Yeah, very casually, right? Yeah. No segue whatsoever. Your academic transition from and again, like sort of anyone who understands what it takes to get tenure at an academic institution at a university, and they look at you and you go, and you have it, and you've sort of reached that pinnacle, and now you're moving on to, so at Bowling Green, and now you're moving on to the Hamilton School. And I'm interested, what precipitated that change, and I would love to know more about. I don't know much about the Hamilton School and its relationship to, I guess, University of Florida, and what you expect to do there that might be different and maybe the same in some ways as what you're currently doing.
Yeah, so I've been at Bowling Green for 9 years. Been tenured. I think this is my fourth year with tenure, which is highly recommend, by the way. It's I started speaking my mind a lot more freely. I didn't think this was true, but other people had told me, and so I guess I believe them. But I started speaking my mind more freely after I got tenure, and when you do that, there are significant professional costs when you're heterodox. I mean, I don't think anyone denies that. In fact, some people wish they were greater costs for speaking your mind heterodox. Uh, and so, when I got the job at Bowling Green, I thought, well, if this is my job, this is my job. It's a perfectly great job. I have nothing to be embarrassed about. I'm happy to be here with the family. I grew up in Indiana. And, I've had some great colleagues over the years, come through here and have become close friends. Um, and you just sort of think, I think most academics think, well, most academics don't get second jobs. It just never happens. But an opportunity came last year when I was on sabbatical at the University of Colorado and with the Hamilton School. And my friend David McPherson is already a philosopher there. The goal of which is to help renew and revive, reinvigorate higher education. And it's a school focused on civic education and classical education. So, if you look throughout most universities, civics education, teaching people how to become good citizens, and I think a sort of knowledge base of the history of their place and their nation. You can go through higher ed and not learn these things, and so the idea is to provide a college. Now its own college, the University of Florida. They're hiring about 60 tenure stream faculty across discipline, philosophy, political theory, political science, history, literature, statecraft, and there'll be four majors. I always forget some of them. PPEL, philosophy, politics, economics, and law, which is the one that I'll be mostly teaching in. Great books and ideas, statecraft, and what's the other one? I always forget the other one. Anyway, there's four majors, and so it's just an exciting time. I mean, I think very few people would deny that higher ed needs to be freshened up. They have different views about what that means, but I think most people think, for various reasons, some demographic, some political, higher ed in a tough spot. There's a very low public trust in higher ed, and people have different theories about why. But I think one theory that I think is largely true is that the public had a social contract with higher ed after World War II, and the social contract was, we will fund you and give you money if you educate our young people, teach them how to be good citizens, prepare them for life and their vocations, and that's it. And I think for decades, universities have, in one way or another, defaulted on that social contract and have turned themselves into something else. And I think, in my view, places like the Hamilton School and other places in different universities, public universities across the country, what they're trying to do is earn back public trust by hewing closer to that social contract. And so this is an exciting opportunity. I mean, I'm thrilled. I mean, I lived in Florida for 3 years when I was in grad school at Florida State, and I'm from the Midwest, and I winters are great, but I'm eager to move to Florida, and with some extremely sharp and productive scholars. There's no dead wood. Uh, there's no dead wood in the Hamilton School. Everyone's a serious person about publishing. I actually have a little, everyone comes from like Yale or Cambridge or Harvard. I have a little like, I went to state school, whatever. It's like in Arizona, and they're very exceptionally talented people. The students they're getting are exceptionally talented. They're coming from all over the country. Students who otherwise gone to Columbia who are like, I'm tired. I'm tired of a campus that's basically just an ideological playground. That's not why I want to come here. And so, they're drawing really smart, motivated students to come to Florida. So, it's bittersweet to leave Bowling Green. We've had some institutional challenges. We're losing the PhD program and philosophy master's degree. And, that just changes the culture of the place. And so it's bittersweet. But yeah, thanks for asking. I'm really excited about building a new institution. Few academics ever in their careers get the chance to build. It's mostly maintain or destroy. But to try to build something new in the middle of your career is pretty exciting.
That's great. I mean, it sounds like an amazing opportunity. Maybe the last question that I'll ask you, and it can be as brief as you want it to be, is I've talked before about just the incentive structures for academic institutions, and just keying off of what you said in your response, that part of the contract with the public is you send your student to an institution, and most people don't understand that the vast majority of professors are there to do research primarily. That's what they get paid to do. That's the incentive structure. You do more research, you get paid more, et cetera. Do you have any ideas on how institutions, the system of academia, can incentivize professors for more teaching and mentoring? Maybe in addition to research, but that just seems, to me, as I look at it, that just seems like this overwhelming vacuum right now.
Yeah, this is a difficult problem because it's hard to incentive unless someone is an excellent teacher, and people that didn't use out what that means, who's devoted to mentorship. It's hard to incentivize and reward good teachers because the measures, student evaluations are just a train wreck. I mean, I feel like I have a pretty good idea of, if I see someone give a talk or teach a class, I know when someone's a good teacher. I have a pretty good sense of that. But people can disagree. Um, I think, it used to be 70 years ago, most professors, if you taught in a college or university, you were not doing research or much research. If you taught at even Bowling Green, 70 years ago, the faculty here, and this is no criticism, it's just wasn't the expectation. It wasn't a professional norm that you come to a place and publish 2 papers a year. That was not the expectation. And so I do think, there's been a blurring of the lines between what you might think of as like liberal arts or teaching colleges and research universities. And so, you teach at a lot of these schools, there's an expectation to do research. And oftentimes the people who do the best research are not the best teachers. I think you all know that. So I don't know what the solution is. I mean, one solution is just to lean more heavily on kind of the bifurcated model, which is you have teachers, colleges, and universities, or universities, and you have research universities. That's a way to solve the problem, or at least try to think about solving the problem. The problem though is that research universities are often giving their students a very bad product. And a lot of research focused professors are just bad, bad teachers, not just mediocre, but bad teachers. They don't care. And I don't know how you solve that problem. I mean, I am not one of these people who thinks that tenure, like, no matter how poorly you do your job, that tenure should protect you. I don't know if that means reducing pay for bad teachers or just, devoting, someone's contract is 100% research, reduce their pay and then pay someone else to teach their classes who's actually good. I don't know how you solve this problem, but there are stellar researchers who are horrible teachers, and then they teach these 500 student sections of chemistry or whatever, and the students have no idea what just happened, and so they have to do their TA and like learn the material. And then there are professors who are bad at all parts of their jobs. I mean, there are professors who haven't published in 20 years and are phoning it in the classroom. I mean, they have not refreshed or updated their course material in 50 years. I mean, there are people who are bad at their jobs in every way. Don't respond to emails, don't do service, right? In my view, tenure should not protect you. That's not what tenure is for. Tenure is a contract. It's an agreement. It's not a reward for what you did. It's an investment in what they think you're going to do. And if you don't follow through on that investment, something should happen. I don't know what that is, but so yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think something would be lost if teaching faculty at teaching universities did no research. And I get frustrated when I see people hired for their teaching ability when they've done no research and they're hired over someone who is a great teacher and a great researcher. I think calling someone a great teacher is a fudge word. You can't be using the fudge word to like hire someone for less noble reasons. And I don't know how you solve that problem. Yeah. Do you have any ideas about that?
No, I really don't. I mean, you brought up a lot. I think I'd have to think about it more. I mean, the division of labor, but generally speaking, in my experience, everything that you said, I've seen firsthand at the institutional university level as well, where because they're different skills. It just isn't a guarantee that if you're a good researcher, you're going to be able to stand up in front of a classroom and pitch and communicate ideas well to people who have never even thought about the topic that you're bringing up. In fact, I had advice when I was a PhD student. It was like, don't teach on your research area, because in your mind, you're assuming all these things that the undergrads are not even privy to. They just have not thought about it to that level, and that you forget that level when you're teaching. So,
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, I like the topic. I don't have any solutions either. I want to be respectful of your time, Dr. Brendan Warmke. Thank you so much for coming on. I want to make sure that if people want to follow your work, and in any capacity, social media, maybe Phil Papers or your website, like where can people go if they want to follow what you do?
Well, I'm on X, Twitter. What the spicy thing? If you want the academic stuff, pretty much everything I've written is on my website, which is brandonwarmke.com.
Excellent. And you have a book in the works?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. I'm trying to write a book on conservatism right now. I'm trying to explain what it means to be conservative and why people are conservative about the world. But it's going very slowly. So.
Yeah, I'd expect that, but maybe whenever it comes out, I'd love to have you back on and maybe go through some of that. And there were 100 questions that I had right here, weren't able to get to them. But thanks again for coming on. Such a rich conversation, and appreciate what you do.
Thanks, Jared. Appreciate it.